In Hollywood's glittering constellation, some stars burn bright and fade quickly. Others endure, their light forged in the crucible of unimaginable pain. At 78, Sally Field represents something far rarer than fame. She is living proof that the human spirit cannot be broken, only transformed. This is not the sanitized story of America's sweetheart. This is the raw, unflinching truth of a woman who turned her deepest scars into her greatest strength. Today, as she sits in her Pacific Palisades sanctuary overlooking an endless ocean, Sally Field carries within her a lifetime of secrets that would have destroyed lesser souls. Her journey reads like a masterclass in survival, from the suffocating darkness of childhood trauma to the blinding lights of Hollywood's biggest stages, from the wreckage of broken love to the quiet triumph of self-acceptance. Before we explore the heartbreaking tragedy that defines her story at 78, we must first witness the fires that forged her. The house in Pasadena should have been a sanctuary. Instead, it became Sally's first battlefield. Born November 6, 1946, she entered a world already fracturing at its foundation. Her mother, Margaret Field, moved through life with the polished grace of a Paramount Pictures actress. But beneath that Hollywood veneer lay a woman, too absorbed in her own survival to protect her daughter. Her father, Richard Dryden Field, carried the rigid discipline of a World War II veteran, but his presence offered cold authority rather than warmth. When the marriage shattered in 1950, 4-year-old Sally didn't understand the legal papers or the shouting matches. She only knew that her world had suddenly become smaller, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. The divorce wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the beginning of Sally's education in abandonment, a lesson that would echo through every relationship for decades to come. Enter Jock Mahoney, rugged, charismatic, everything Hollywood demanded from its stuntmen. To the outside world, he represented security and charm. To 13-year-old Sally, he became a predator whose violations would poison her understanding of trust, love, and her own worth. The abuse wasn't just physical, it was a systematic destruction of a child's sense of safety, conducted in the shadows while her mother chose blindness over protection. Decades later, in her searing memoir, In Pieces, Sally would write with devastating honesty about those years of violation. But perhaps more heartbreaking than the abuse itself was the silence that surrounded it. Her mother's willful ignorance. The family's collective agreement to pretend nothing was happening. The crushing weight of carrying such a secret alone. Sally learned early that the adults in her life could not be trusted to protect her. A lesson that would haunt every relationship that followed. In that suffocating atmosphere of secrets and shame, Sally discovered her first and most vital escape route: acting. On the sets where her mother worked, she watched actors inhabit different lives, speak truths that were forbidden in her own home. Drama class became her sanctuary, a place where becoming someone else offered temporary relief from being herself. Acting wasn't a career choice for Sally. It was survival by other means. The talent scout who spotted her at a high school party in the early 1960s couldn't have known he was offering a lifeline to a drowning girl. When Columbia Studios called, Sally saw more than an opportunity. She saw a chance to transform her pain into something powerful. But Hollywood, as she would soon discover, had its own ways of silencing inconvenient truths. At 17, Sally faced another devastating violation of trust. An unplanned pregnancy following a graduation party encounter thrust her into a nightmare orchestrated by the same stepfather who had already shattered her childhood. Without consultation or care, Jock Mahoney arranged for her to be taken to a shadowy clinic in Tijuana, Mexico. No gentle voices explaining the procedure, no mother holding her hand, just a terrified teenager in a foreign room, abandoned by the very people who should have protected her. The physical procedure was traumatic enough, but the emotional abandonment, her mother's calculated absence during this crisis, carved wounds that would never fully heal. This wasn't about politics or reproductive rights. This was about a young woman learning that her pain was less important than her family's comfort. her voice less valuable than their silence. But trauma, as Sally would prove repeatedly throughout her life, can become fuel for transformation. That abandoned teenager would grow into one of Hollywood's most passionate advocates for women's rights, driven not by theory but by lived experience. She knew firsthand what it meant to be silenced, and she refused to let other women suffer the same fate. But in 1976, the gamble paid off. Sybil arrived like a thunderclap, shattering every preconceived notion about Sally Field's abilities. Playing a young woman with multiple personalities, each born from childhood trauma, Sally drew from reservoirs of pain that most actors could never access. She embodied 13 distinct personalities, each with its own voice, mannerisms, and emotional landscape. The performance was a revelation. Critics who had dismissed her as lightweight were forced to confront an artist of startling depth and complexity. The Emmy Award that followed was more than recognition. It was vindication for every year of being underestimated, every role that diminished her capabilities, every person who couldn't see past the sunny exterior to the fierce intelligence beneath. But even as professional recognition began to arrive, Sally's personal life remained a landscape of unresolved trauma and recurring patterns of abandonment. The late 1970s brought both her greatest professional triumph and one of her most devastating personal relationships, a combination that would nearly destroy her before ultimately revealing her true strength. But Norma Rae demanded something different. The role required her to embody a Southern textile worker fighting union injustices, a character whose working-class grit and fierce determination resonated with Sally's own battles against being dismissed and underestimated. When she stood on that factory floor, holding the union sign above her head in defiant silence, she wasn't just playing a character. She was channeling decades of her own voiceless fury. The Academy Award that followed in 1980 represented more than professional validation. Standing on that stage, holding the Oscar that proved she could carry dramatic weight, Sally finally silenced the voices that had questioned her abilities. But even in triumph, the scars remained. Her acceptance speech, humble and grateful, revealed a woman still surprised that the world had finally chosen to see her. 5 years later, Places in the Heart provided another opportunity to transform personal pain into cinematic truth. Playing a widowed mother struggling to save her farm during the Great Depression, Sally drew from her own experiences of abandonment and survival. The preparation was exhausting. She immersed herself in rural life, learning the physical and emotional rhythms of a world far removed from Hollywood glamour. When she accepted her second Oscar in 1985, her spontaneous words, "You like me. Right now, you like me," became a cultural moment. Critics mocked the phrase as narcissistic, missing its deeper truth. This wasn't vanity speaking. It was a woman who had spent a lifetime feeling invisible, finally experiencing the shock of being truly seen. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, Sally continued to choose roles that challenged both herself and audiences' expectations. In Steel Magnolias, she delivered a performance of quiet devastation as a mother losing her child. In Mrs. Doubtfire, she brought complexity to what could have been a simple comedic role. And in Forrest Gump, she created one of cinema's most tender maternal figures, a woman whose love transcends her son's limitations. Each role carried the weight of her lived experience. Every mother she played on screen was informed by her own fierce protection of her children. Every woman fighting against limitation drew from her battles with an industry reluctant to offer complex roles to aging actresses. She wasn't just acting, she was bearing witness to truths about womanhood that Hollywood rarely acknowledged. But professional success, as Sally had learned repeatedly, offered no protection from a personal heartbreak. Her journey through love would prove to be as complex and painful as her career struggles, marked by a pattern of seeking salvation through others while slowly learning that the only lasting security comes from within. Sally's first marriage to Stephen Craig in 1968 seemed to promise the stability she'd never known as a child. At 22, fresh from early fame and carrying invisible wounds from her traumatic adolescence, She desperately wanted to build the normal family life that had been denied to her. Craig appeared to offer that sanctuary. Steady, conventional, safe. Their two sons, Peter, born in 1969, and Eli in 1972, brought Sally a joy so fierce it became her compass. Holding her children, she experienced love without conditions or complications for the first time. Their laughter-filled spaces in her heart she hadn't even known were empty. For a brief time, she believed she had finally found her true calling as wife and mother. But beneath the surface of domestic tranquility, familiar patterns were emerging. Craig's ambitions pulled him in one direction, while Sally, juggling sleepless nights as a mother with the demands of a Hollywood career, found herself drifting alone. Then came Burt Reynolds, and with him, the most passionate and destructive relationship of Sally's life. They met in 1977 on the set of Smokey and the Bandit, and within 4 days the attraction had ignited into something consuming and dangerous. To the public, they were Hollywood royalty, his rugged charisma perfectly complementing her luminous warmth. Behind the camera flashes lay a different story, one written in the language of control, jealousy, and emotional manipulation. Reynolds, at the peak of his fame, carried a swagger that could fill any room, but beneath it lurked deep insecurities that infected every aspect of their relationship. He could be magnetic one moment and cutting the next, undermining her confidence and trying to keep her brilliance contained within the shadow of his own. When Sally was offered Norma Rae, the role that would define her career, Reynolds dismissed it outright. "You're not good enough," he told her, words that would echo in her mind even as she later stood holding an Academy Award for that very performance. On the night of her greatest triumph, he refused to accompany her to the Oscars, leaving her to face the moment alone. "I was always trying to prove I was enough for him," Sally would later admit, her voice carrying both steel and sorrow. In her memoir, she was even more candid. "He made me feel small. He belittled me, controlled me, and I stayed, hoping I could make it right." The cycle became a prison she couldn't escape. Moments of deep connection followed by sharp, wounding words that left her questioning her own worth. For 5 years, she endured the emotional roller coaster, clinging to hope that love might transform what pain could not touch. But she slowly learned that love cannot heal what someone refuses to confront within themselves. When their relationship finally ended in 1982, it wasn't a clean break. It was an unraveling that felt like tearing away part of her soul. What followed was 30 years of absolute silence. No phone calls, no letters, not even chance encounters. The years rolled forward, each one closing the door tighter on what might have been. Near the end of Reynolds' life, he finally called, his voice older and worn, carrying words she had once ached to hear. "You were the love of my life." It was too late, Sally wrote. "I had carried the weight of his love for too long, and by the time he offered it freely, I had already set it down." She mourned him, not just the man, but the decades they lost to pride, fear, and the inability to meet each other where healing was possible. In 1984, at 38, Sally made another attempt at marriage with producer Alan Graceman. Their union seemed to promise the calm after the storm. Less turbulent, more grounded. In 1987, they welcomed her third son, Sam, whose arrival brought another anchor of joy to her often chaotic life. When Sam later came out as gay, it deepened Sally's understanding of unconditional love and strengthened her voice as an advocate for LGBTQ+ rights. But even this calmer relationship eventually succumbed to the familiar patterns of emotional distance and unmet needs. By 1994, Sally recognized the signs she had once ignored in her youth. This time, she understood the difference between walking away in defeat and walking away in self-preservation. She chose the latter. "I've never been good at choosing a spouse," she would joke in the later interviews, her humor a gentle veil over the quiet ache of remembering. But behind the smile was the truth of a woman who had survived love's sweetest illusions and its sharpest edges, who had finally learned that seeking salvation through others was a fool's game. At 78, Sally's romantic journey stands not as a tragedy, but as a long transformation. Every heartbreak carved a clearer sense of her worth. Every farewell taught her that love should never come at the expense of one's soul. And perhaps most importantly, she discovered that the most radical love she could claim was the one she gave to herself. The kind that says, without apology, "I am enough." But just as she thought she had weathered life's cruelest storms, fate delivered one final test that would either break her completely or forge her into something unshakable. On October 29, 1988, Sally Field came face to face with her own mortality in a way that changed everything. The day began like any other journey, ordinary, unremarkable, threaded with routine plans and idle thoughts. Sally boarded a private jet owned by television icon Merv Griffin, settling in with family members for what should have been a peaceful flight from Aspen. The mountains stood solemn against a crisp October sky as the engines roared to life. Then, in a single heartbeat, everything changed. Just seconds into takeoff, the engines faltered, a sickening hesitation that sent ice through her veins. Before her mind could process the danger, gravity seized them. The sound was inhuman, shrieking steel, splintering glass, the collective gasp of people certain they had reached their final moment. Smoke poured into the cabin as loose objects became weapons in the chaos. Through the pandemonium, Sally heard a voice crying out, raw and unrecognizable before realizing it was her own. Time fractured into fragments, a single second stretched into an endless corridor of terror. She would later recall the acrid burn of fuel in her throat, the suffocating heat against her skin, and the desperate search through smoke and confusion for the voices of her loved ones. Then came silence. Strange, heavy quiet that made her wonder if she had already crossed beyond life. Against impossible odds, all 4 passengers walked away with only minor physical injuries, but not all wounds bleed visibly. In the weeks and months that followed, the crash returned to Sally in merciless flashes, fragments of sensory memory stitched together into a reel she couldn't stop playing. She could see the precise angle of the wing before impact, hear the final rasp of failing engines, feel her own hands trembling so violently she could barely free herself from her seatbelt. Publicly, she brushed aside questions about the crash, refusing to let survival become spectacle. Privately, the experience rearranged something fundamental within her. "I thought, this is it. This is how my story ends," she would later confess. But it hadn't ended, and that realization became the hinge on which the rest of her life swung. Surviving what felt like a final chapter made every page afterward feel sacred. The endless chase for Hollywood's applause, the sting of failed love, the career doubts that once gnawed at her, all of it shrank when measured against the gift of a spared life. Friends noticed the change before she spoke of it. Her voice quieter but stronger, her gaze deeper, her patience for small moments unshakable. The crash left no visible scars, but it carved an indelible truth into her soul. Life hangs by the thinnest thread, and every breath after survival carries both burden and blessing. For a woman who had endured childhood betrayals, toxic love, and decades of being underestimated, this was simply one more trial. And like all the others, she emerged not untouched, but unbroken. From that day forward, Sally Field lived differently, with more gratitude, more courage, and more heart than ever before. The crash wasn't her ending. It was a violent, breathtaking pause that marked the beginning of her most authentic chapter yet. Today, at 78, Sally Field has stepped away from Hollywood's relentless glare into the gentle rhythm of Pacific Palisades life. Her 2,800-square-foot home perches in the Castellamar Hills, where each sunset spills gold and rose across the Pacific horizon, as if the sky itself honors the battles she has fought. Despite a net worth of $50 million, Sally chooses simplicity over extravagance. Her Lexus RX 450h hybrid SUV speaks to values of reliability and environmental consciousness rather than status. Her daily routine reflects the same intentional modesty: a mostly plant-based diet, regular yoga practice, and morning walks that keep both body and spirit anchored in gratitude. "I've made peace with my past," she says, her smile carrying decades of hard-won self-respect. "Now I just love my grandkids." Her days center around the family she built through years of both joy and heartbreak. As a grandmother 5 times over, she's often found kneeling in her garden with tiny hands helping plant flowers beside her, laughing over board games in the living room, or reading bedtime stories with the same tenderness she once brought to the screen. Her 3 sons, Peter, Eli, and Sam, remain her greatest pride. When Sam came out as gay, it deepened her understanding of unconditional love and ignited her advocacy for LGBTQ+ rights. In 2012, she accepted the Human Rights Campaign's Ally for Equality Award, her voice steady and resolute as she spoke about the courage required to live authentically. Even in her later years, when public appearances are carefully chosen, Sally remains an unshakable force for justice. She's stood with Jane Fonda for climate action, even risking arrest to make her voice heard. When she speaks on reproductive rights, her words carry the gravity of lived experience and personal history that cannot be argued away. Her health has demanded its own kind of courage. The osteoporosis diagnosis in 2005 was a jarring reminder that time leaves its marks on everyone. Rather than retreat, she launched the Rally with Sally campaign to encourage early screening and bone health awareness, determined to protect others from being blindsided as she was. Even now, she adapts her daily life with mindfulness, choosing walks that strengthen rather than strain, practicing gentle yoga flows at sunrise, avoiding foods that no longer serve her well. She speaks openly of mornings when stiffness greets her before sunlight, yet she meets those moments with patience, not defeat. To Sally, wellness isn't about perfection, it's about presence. She steps into the public eye only when it matters most, to advocate, to share her truth, to remind others that survival and truly living are not the same thing. The golden statues on her shelves have long been outshone by crayon drawings taped to her refrigerator door. To Sally, wellness isn't about perfection, it's about presence. She steps into the public eye only when it matters most, to advocate, to share her truth, to remind others that survival and truly living are not the same thing. The golden statues on her shelves have long been outshone by crayon drawings taped to her refrigerator door. In 2018, she released her deeply candid memoir, In Pieces, calling it a gift to the little girl I used to be, scared, silenced, and searching for love. That little girl she knows would be proud of the woman she became. Her evenings now are spent on her deck, watching Pacific waves roll endlessly toward shore, sometimes with tea in hand, sometimes with a grandchild tucked under her arm. She has survived abandonment, broken marriages, fame's scrutiny, self-doubt's quiet war, and an aging body's humbling realities. Yet each morning she rises to ocean breezes, to laughter, to the steady heartbeat of a life built entirely on her own terms. For Sally Field, the stage may have dimmed, but her inner light burns warmer than ever, a beacon of gratitude, endurance, and the rare peace that comes from finally and fiercely loving the life you've created. But there is one more chapter to her story, one that reveals the true magnitude of what she has overcome and why her journey matters now more than ever. At 78, as she reflects on a lifetime of battles fought and victories earned, Sally Field faces perhaps her most important role yet, showing the world what it looks like to age with dignity, purpose, and uncompromising authenticity. Her legacy extends far beyond 2 Academy Awards or decades of applause. It lives in every woman who has been told she's not enough and chosen to prove otherwise. In every survivor of abuse who found their voice. In every mother who fought to protect her children while building her own dreams. and every person who refused to let their worst moments become their final story. Sally Field didn't just survive Hollywood, she changed it, carving space where honesty could stand taller than artifice, where vulnerability could be recognized as strength. She showed us that the most powerful performances come not from perfection, but from the courage to remain human in a world that demands otherwise. As she enters what she calls her bonus years, Sally Field continues to live with the fierce intentionality of someone who has looked death in the face and chosen life. Every sunrise from her Pacific Palisades deck, every laugh shared with grandchildren, every quiet moment in her garden represents a victory over forces that tried to silence her. Her story reminds us that resilience isn't about avoiding pain. It's about transforming it into something meaningful. That survival isn't enough. We must also learn to thrive. And that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply refusing to let your scars define your limits. At 78, Sally Field stands as living proof that no matter how dark the beginning, how cruel the middle, how uncertain the ending, the human spirit possesses an extraordinary capacity for healing, growth, and grace. Her tragedy was never in what happened to her. It was in how long the world took to recognize the strength she had always possessed. Today, that recognition is complete. Sally Field is not just a legend. She is a testament to the transformative power of truth, the healing force of authenticity, and the eternal possibility that our deepest wounds can become our greatest gifts to the world. If Sally Field's journey has stirred something within you, a memory, a recognition, a spark of your own resilience, then her story has served its purpose. She reminds us that we are all capable of rewriting our endings, of transforming our pain into power, of emerging from life's darkest chapters, not as victims, but as victors. In a world that often feels broken beyond repair, Sally Field offers something precious: hope. Hope that healing is possible, that voices can be found, that love, beginning with love for ourselves, can triumph over the deepest wounds. At 78, her greatest performance isn't on any screen. It's the life she continues to live with courage, dignity, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of redemption. This is Sally Field's gift to us: the knowledge that no matter how heartbreaking our tragedies, we possess the power to write our own triumphant endings.